One more time. A very warm welcome. This really is a tremendous personal pleasure and a source of professional pride to be able to host you and welcome you again in Oriental Hall for the 99th Tahrir Dialogue since we started this series a decade ago. As I've repeatedly said, these dialogues are always special. They are only convened on very topical occasions and only when we have exceptional guests and speakers. Both of these criteria apply today. In fact, we have yet a third important dimension that makes this session particularly relevant and important. This third dimension is the culmination and release of a university-wide study with significant contribution from academics, intellectuals, practitioners, both at AUC throughout its different schools, but also throughout the Arab world. The result of this effort is a report entitled AlMostaqbal, Envisaging a Better Arab Future, a blue ribbon report that I'm sure you will find extremely interesting. It encompasses the efforts in a over 2-year study in culmination of a thought process that was initiated on a very auspicious occasion, and that was the 100th anniversary of AUC. This is what we call a centennial project of the university at large. And I think it is neither surprising, it is not surprising, and quite understandable that AUC would choose this kind of project for this occasion. This university has made the stability, security, prosperity, and well-being of the Arab world one of its main points of interest in whatever domain it attempts to contribute to. And it is keen on finding constructive synergies between rigorous academic thinking and practices and real-life issues and priorities to our communities. Let me add here that as Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, I can, on behalf of the school, say that we were extremely happy to be asked by the university to shepherd this process and try to elaborate on the idea, lead it to a set of constructive ideas and proposals. This is, I think, relevant to our work in particular because, for lack of a better term, we are a policy school dealing with public affairs. And we define public affairs not only in the domestic and regional domain, but also as in the global context. It is also a particular source of satisfaction that we are able to encourage a discussion, debate, study, and a set of recommendations from Arabs about their future. We have repeatedly reiterated that Arabs need to speak out about where they want to go, what they want to do. We need to have a multitude of opinions on how to move this region forward, because if we don't, if we remain complacent about what's happening or simply responding to initiatives by others, we will ultimately, again, see an increasing loss of influence in this region, and that is not anything that serves the Arab world well. I want to emphasize, as I said, GAP was simply the shepherd within AUC with a lot of contributions from colleagues and different schools throughout the university. But this was also an effort that involved not only Egyptians, not only Cairo-based individuals, but we reached out to Arabs throughout the Arab world, from Al-Maghrib al-Arabi right through North Africa to the Levant and then down to the Gulf. Our objective was to bring out issues of particular interest and concern, to share opinions, and if possible, to come up with some policy recommendations. We did not attempt to get into particular issues with any great detail, but we did highlight what we felt was of particular importance, be that in the socioeconomic or the political and conflict resolution phase. I am intentionally, in spite of my own instincts, staying away from getting into the details of the report because we have a wonderful panel up here and they've given us from their time, so I'm going to leave the details to them. But let me nevertheless say that the group, while initially composed of 3 working groups, a regional security and conflict working group, an economic working group, and a social working group, decided to merge into 2, socioeconomic as one and regional security and conflict as the other. And this was done because you can't work in isolation, whether it's socioeconomic or, for that matter, security and stability and development. So in the end of the day, the report and the conclusions, the recommendations are meant to provide a holistic approach to dealing with these issues, not a detailed solution to them, but a holistic approach to dealing with them. And what we wanted to do, because it's being hosted by an academic institution, a university, not an intergovernmental institution, what we attempted to do is to bring out ideas, bring out opinions, bring out scenarios, and create a platform for further discussions, be that by Arabs, well, primarily by Arabs, and hopefully even by governments in the Arab world. And I think the intention here is also to share what we did with different governments around the Arab world, with the hope that they look at these issues and recommendations. In conclusion, let me simply say that the report focuses on a couple of things. What is the current Arab security landscape? Where is the Arab world in the general global division of labor? Where are the emerging policy challenges as we look forward rather than simply looking backward? What are future pathways for regional security, for the different regional security scenarios? And finally, a series of policy recommendations in all of those areas, almost without exceptions. As I just said a few minutes ago, I am extremely proud of the work done because it took and chose the proper direction for the work, what we do moving forward, and it also was done in a very rigorous, yet collegial fashion. Many different opinions were expressed, but and some of them were quite passionate. But at the end of the day, it was done with a constructive attitude and approach. We have, as I just said, a tremendous panel, and among them are Professor Amr Adli from the Department of Political Science, Ambassador Ramzi, who was a former Egyptian ambassador and former Assistant Secretary of the United Nations and Deputy Envoy on Syria, Dr. Lisa Anderson, who was the former president of AUC and is presently a special lecturer, and James C. Shotwell, Professor of International Relations at Columbia University, Dr. Heba Rashad, the Director of the Social Research Center here at AUC, and Dr. Iman Regab was going to be here, but she had a family emergency, so she couldn't come. Also originally planned to be here was Trustee Tariq Masoud, but he caught what most of us caught over the last few months, COVID, and could not travel. So Professor Karim Haggag has, with his generosity, offered to take his place and moderate the panel. And our best wishes, of course, are to Tariq to get well soon. Let me start off before giving the floor to Karim by inviting Dr. Ahmed Dalal, the president of AUC, to convey some thoughts and insights and ideas as to the project and what he'd like AUC to do on this or other things. And then Karim will immediately take charge of the panel and manage the rest of the evening. Thank you. Dr. Dalal? And I apologize for where the podium is set, but there's no place with this size back.
Good evening, colleagues, excellencies. It's good to have you here tonight. In April 2019, as part of AUC Centennial campaign, the university launched an initiative entitled AlMostaqbal, the Middle East Looking Forward. The initiative was aimed at examining regional issues and challenges and formulating policy suggestions focused on building a better future in the Middle East. Today, 3 years later, the final outcome of the conference is a blue ribbon report entitled AlMostaqbal, Envisioning a Better Arab Future. The report offers rigorous analysis by Arab statesmen, academics, and opinion makers of the challenges facing the Arab world and charts, in its words, charts an alternative course for the future of the Arab world. When the initiative was launched, its focus was the future of the Middle East in the context of 2 eventful and transformative decades that brought to the forefront the aspirations of the peoples of the Middle East, but also undermined the stability of the region and devastated several regional states. Today, a mere 3 years later, these challenges persist and are further magnified by a turbulent global order. Conflicts and polarization, increased economic disparities, environmental degradation, food and water shortages, and the global erosion of individual rights and freedoms. Not to mention, of course, the pandemic that brought the world to a standstill and reminded us of our collective vulnerabilities. The challenges are both regional and global, as are the solutions. It's therefore all the more urgent to emphasize the need for a regional perspective to better understand the challenges facing the Middle East and the Arab world, and perhaps more important, to write this regional perspective into any global conversation about the future of the region. And this is what AlMostaqbal report tries to do, I think. So I would like to thank the contributors to the AlMostaqbal report for providing this perspective and for their commitment to the region and its future, and I look forward to the discussion by our colleagues of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, President Dalal. Thank you, Dean Fahmy. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Karim Haggag. I am a professor of practice at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and it's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to this launch event of the Blue Ribbon Report for the AlMostaqbal project. So the document you have before you, the Blue Ribbon Report, is a substantive document. It's a document that includes analysis, projections, policy recommendations. It is rich in both detail and also diverse perspectives as to how to analyze the different trends, both socioeconomic and also within the realm of regional security that affect the Arab world. So this is quite a hefty document, which we hope you will find to be an interesting and insightful read. Now, to summarize this document, or at least to highlight its main conclusions and insights, is a very challenging task. And to conduct that task, we have assembled what I think is a very high-quality panel to discuss the main findings and conclusions of this report. Allow me to introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak. So as our first presenter, we have the distinct pleasure of having Ambassador Ramzi Izzeddin. Ambassador Ramzi's diplomatic career spans over 43 years as a distinguished member of Egypt's Foreign Service. Ambassador Ramzi's latest assignment was with the United Nations, where he served as the Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Special Envoy for Syria from 2014 to 2019. His longest and distinguished career also saw him serving as Egypt's ambassador to Germany, to Austria, to Brazil, to Slovakia. In addition to him being Egypt's permanent representative to the United Nations and the governing board of the International Atomic Energy Agency, among others. Our other presenter for this evening will be Dr. Amr Adli, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Adli worked as a researcher at the Middle East Directions Program at the European University Institute, and he also worked as a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center, where his research focused on issues related to the political economy and development studies of the Middle East. Our two presenters will give an overview of both sections of the report, the regional security and conflicts section of the report, and also the socioeconomic portion of the report. After which, we have two very distinguished panelists to give their views and commentaries on the initial set of presentations. Dr. Huda Rashad is a professor and director of the Social Research Center at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Rashad holds a doctorate in population studies from the University of London, and in her long and distinguished research career, she has served in numerous advisory capacities with the United Nations, as an associate of the International Population Council, and also with the World Health Organization, in addition to serving in her capacity as an advisor to numerous Egyptian national bodies, including the Egyptian Academy of Scientific Research, and also as a member of the Egyptian Senate or the Shura Council. Last but certainly not least, we're very pleased to have join us Dr. Lisa Anderson, who is a special lecturer and James T. Shotwell Professor of International Relations at the Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. But of course, we all know Dr. Anderson as a result of her time with us as a very distinguished president, former president of the American University in Cairo from 2011 to 2016, a very momentous time for Egypt and the university. And before that, she served as the university's provost and earlier as the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. So before I hand the microphone to our two presenters, let me point out for the audience that we do have translation for this event, whether for those of you joining us online or whether those of you present with us in person. And after the initial set of presentations and comments, we will open it up to questions and answers. And once again, for those of you who are joining us online, please send your comments and or questions through the chat, and I will integrate those into our discussion as we go along. So if I could turn to our two presenters initially, Ambassador Ramzi and Dr. Adli. If I could ask each of you to give us your highlights of the different sections of the report that you worked on. And if I could ask you to keep your comments to 10 minutes before we move on to the rest of the panel. Ambassador Ramzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karim. President Dalal, Dean Fahmy, I wanted to thank, through Dean Fahmy, his staff, who have made this report possible. It was a privilege being part of this very important group of thinkers and eminent personalities in the Arab world, stretching literally from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf. So they brought in different perceptions, threat perceptions, but also domestic priorities. And it was a very interesting exchange, but ultimately, and I think that is the most important thing, they converged on a common ground that allowed this report to be produced. Now, this common ground is basically anchored into what I would call a common security approach, in the sense that there are threats to Arab security to which all the participants shared, but also there was an understanding for the need for cooperative mechanisms to address these security threats. Now, the report comes at a very opportune time. The international system has been going through a transition since the fall of the Berlin Wall, a transition that has brought in many contradictory trends. You have globalization and insular nationalism, liberal economic policies and government intervention, free trade and protectionism, free flow of labor, but at the same time, barriers are erected to stop that. And I can go on, but these contradictions exist with us until today. And if you'll allow me, I will refer very quickly to the Ukraine, which is a very much on our minds, because if anything, what is happening in Ukraine goes far beyond Ukraine or even European security. It is also about how the future international political system will look like, political and economic system will look like. So, going back to transition, it has been difficult, complicated, and confusing for everyone, for every country around the world, but maybe even more so in our part of the world. Three events that have had a great impact on the economic and political evolution in the Arab world over the past years. First was 9/11. Second was the invasion of Iraq. And third, of course, was the Arab Spring. And these events revealed the deficiencies, some of them are structural deficiencies, within Arab countries. But they also opened up the Arab space to destabilizing foreign interventions. And we've seen that in Iraq, we've seen that in Syria, we've seen that in Yemen, we've seen it in and Libya. Now, I don't think the Arab world has ever experienced as many security threats from different directions at the same time as we are witnessing or have been witnessing during this transition. You have a number of conflicts. I mean, we've had, of course, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for us for many decades, but we also have Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq has not yet ended one way or the other. The Arab Spring has also revealed state weaknesses. There is a humanitarian crisis, not one, but more than one in the Arab world today, whether it's in Syria or Yemen. There is an issue of resource scarcity, basically in terms of water and food. We can see that in terms of water, not only Egypt, but you also have Syria and Lebanon, being Syria and Iraq also have water shortages, and that can be very dangerous for them. And, of course, there is the erosion of the two-state solution for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Not only that, there are new areas for conflict. There is the Eastern Mediterranean with the new discoveries of gas that has, at one time, and that's a contradiction, at one time it has allowed countries to put together cooperative mechanisms, but it has pitted them against Turkey. So there is a problem there. And also in the Red Sea, where there are different powers who are trying to influence the situation there. There's increased militarization. I mean, the Middle East, we saw the SIPRI report, is the largest importer, has been, but now even more so, of armaments in the world. And that is quite disturbing and possibly destabilizing. We've had terrorism, and although we've had it for some time, but during this transition, we have seen terrorism acquire a territorial base, which we have seen with Daesh in the area between Iraq and Syria, and we see it today with Jabhat al-Nusra in the Syrian province of Idlib. And lastly, of course, COVID-19, which has restricted or hampered the efforts by countries to deal with these security threats. Because of these security threats, it is understandable that Arab countries have focused on the short term, their immediate security threats, at the expense of looking ahead and elaborating a future vision that meets the aspirations of its people. Now, the importance of this report is that it offers a diagnosis, but also offers a way forward. The diagnosis can be, I think, summarized in the existence of two deficits: a security deficit, because the region lacks mechanisms to deal with the security threats, and it has a future deficit, which the report emphasizes, because there is no vision as yet, as Dean Fahmy has said, as to what the future of the region would look like, particularly when it comes to security. Now, having discussed what the security threats are, I think the more important contribution of the report was to lay out what the security trends are. And these are mostly, I mean, to be concise, first there is the Arab core, which is defined as Egypt, I mean the traditional Arab core, Egypt, Iraq, and Syria. These three countries' role and influence has diminished in this transition. Iraq after the Iraq invasion, Syria because of the events in 2011, and Egypt also because 2011 has turned inward, and therefore the Arab core has weakened. Now this has given rise, of course, to a larger role by the GCC countries, but also has opened the door for non-Arab countries to exercise influence, such as, you know, not only Israel, but certainly Turkey and Iran. And the other trend has to do with great power interventions. We have seen the United States seeking to reduce its footprint, reducing a little bit its influence because it's pivoting to Asia. But it's not going to leave the region, but its influence and role will probably diminish with time. Conversely, we have seen Russia becoming more active, positioning itself to be a mediator in various conflicts, and certainly its intervention in Syria has empowered it far more than before. China has shown interest but has not yet assumed a military or security role. The EU has been around, but disappointing in the sense that it is unable to play an independent role, and it continues to work with the United States more than anything else. Even if the United States is going to reduce its presence gradually over time, neither of the other powers is prepared to assume its role. In fact, I think most of them would prefer the United States to continue playing this role because they are not yet in a position to supplant the United States. Now, like the contradictions in the international system, there are contradictions in the Arab world during this transition. We have laid out the security threats, but also the security trends, which are disquieting, but there are seeds for a regional security framework. And I think the challenge is how to make these seeds grow into an actual framework. Now, I will go very quickly through these seeds, these positive developments that have happened. First of all, you have the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum, which is a mechanism for cooperation between various countries in the Eastern Mediterranean when it comes to gas. Then you have the Red Sea Council, which was proposed by Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, but includes other countries both in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. Then you have the Abraham Accords, which offered a way to normalize relations between a number of Arab countries and Israel. And you have also the New Mashriq, which is a cooperative framework between Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan. So all of these things have happened in spite of the disturbing security trends that we have seen. Now, how to deal with that? The report offers 4 scenarios. 2 assume that Arabs would be complacent. The first one is the continuation of the present situation, with no change, which is state fragility, continuation of conflicts, and so forth. And the second is a collapse, in the sense that not only would these trends continue, but they will be exacerbated, and therefore the aspirations of the people in terms of economic and political wishes will not be met, and so there will be a collapse. The third scenario is basically aspirational, transformation, that the countries of the region will be able to agree on a cooperative framework that will meet their security concerns. And the last one is probably more realistic, which is steady stabilization. The situation, there is a continuation of certain trends that exist today, but they will be balanced by movement on solution of some of the conflicts. Countries will be able maybe to have a new social contract that will remedy the deficiencies, the structural deficiencies that they have faced over time. Then we will move to recommendations. Now, of course, the report doesn't have a magic wand, nor does it prescribe specific courses of action, but it does present, I would say, policy approaches that give indications as to where the Arab countries should move, and allowing enough space for governments to articulate specific policies, whether individually or collectively. Now, These recommendations or these policy approaches, I will try to summarize them very quickly. There has to be an emphasis on human security in all its dimensions: economic, political, personal, health, food. Like I said earlier, the Arab Spring has revealed the deficiencies, some of them structural and some of them otherwise, in the states. And therefore, to be able to address them, you need to emphasize human security. Second, because of so many conflicts and the toll they're having on their populations and the neighboring countries, you need to have a post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction, and that is obvious in countries like Syria, Libya, Yemen, even Iraq. And the third area, is you need to devise a regional security framework. We have to be proactive in that. And it could be inspired by the OSCE, and we can get into detail on that later. And finally, and I think this is very important because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has been one of the main reasons of instability in the region. I think we have to preserve the tenets of a two-state solution. And there are various ways of doing it, whether through the United Nations, through the League of Arab States, but that is absolutely important. And we also need to stabilize Gaza, we need to work on Palestinian reconciliation, and we need to empower the Palestinian communities in East Jerusalem. Now, the hope is this report will provide food for thought for governments and other stakeholders to get together and articulate visions, and in this specific case, a framework for regional security in the region. And they need to do that first within the Arab context, so that they will be in a position to be in a better position to negotiate the wider regional security framework with other non-Arab regional countries. So it is a process, and it has to start, in my view, as soon as possible. Unfortunately, if we fail to do that, the Arabs will remain on the receiving side. Their security interests will be secondary to the interests of other regional and extra-regional parties. And in this case, scenarios of collapse and continuation could very well be the case, and that will be to the detriment of the Arab countries. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ramzi. And let me just take this opportunity to personally thank Ambassador Ramzi. I had the great pleasure of chairing the Regional Security and Conflicts Working Group, and Ambassador Ramzi's input and insight really went a long way to developing what I think was a very incisive analysis that was included in the report. Dr. Adli, you were one of the two co-chairs of the Socio-Economic Working Group together with Dr. Ibrahim Awad. I think you would be best placed to give us your overview of the work of the Socio-Economic Working Group in the report.
Thanks a lot, Karim. Okay, so good evening, everyone. So I was asked to represent the findings, the way forward. We didn't call it recommendations, really, because we thought it would be like a bit too much just to write down either a wish list or a list of prescriptions for others to do. So I was asked to go through this in 7 to 10 minutes. Okay. 10 minutes, okay, thank you. How generous of you, okay. So the thing is that we had this extended teamwork. that lasted for a bit over 2 years. That included academics, practitioners, experts, and like people from different parts of the Arab world that were all asked to come together and reflect on the socio-economic conditions to come up with or to identify the patterns and the pathways out of the situation in which the region might be. And in doing so, we actually, like, to my own personal like interest, many extremely like important issues were raised to think of the region as a region in a socio-economic sense rather than just like a security or a cultural sense. And here comes the point that the attempt was to actually bring in some independent thinkers or researchers or whatever in order to reflect on the present and the future of the region. But of course not in isolation like from the rest of the world. The idea of understanding the region as such is not just about the kind of interaction that exists within the region from an economic perspective, but also how the region itself relates to the rest of the world. And that's why it was like a regional yet very much extroverted venture from the very beginning. And this is something that appears in the papers, it appears in how we synthesize the discussion, and in this brief presentation in which I'll try to share with you the main findings. So from the very beginning, we like tried to tackle the question of the socio-economic reality of the region through 3 levels of abstraction. The least abstract of them was definitely the empirical. So we wanted much of the discussion to be very solidly based on empirics, on the existing patterns of exchange when it comes to the role that or like the mode of insertion, if we use the term, of the region as a whole in relation to like the global division of labor when it comes to trade, when it comes to the movement of capital, when it comes to the movement of people, etc., as well as the patterns that exist within the region itself. So that empirical base received some considerable attention, not only through the discussions, but also in the number of papers that were developed and that you may find in the appendices in the report, in the Blue Ribbon report. However, going beyond some of the basic empirical facts was to try to theorize about the position of the region, to discern certain patterns within the region, as well as the ones that link the region to the rest of the world, as well as to put things in like an historic context about what was done in the past 5 or 6 decades since independence. The last level of abstraction, which was the highest one, was more of a normative one, because we took the opportunity in order to raise some questions about how the region should look like in the future. So, like, of course, this was an opportunity to question the hegemony of the neoliberal discourse that has developed or that has, well, like to a great extent defined the values of development as well as the measures of development. And this is something that we had in mind throughout. So the 3 layers are there in each of the papers in the report. This is all like part of the mission of the team as a whole, because like the AUC is definitely one of these well, like rare spots where free research and debate could take place, not only inside Egypt but also like from a regional perspective, and this is something that we explicitly and very consciously aimed for. And the idea is to have this as a well-informed, well-learned, empirically based attempt to engage with whichever public debate that might be there one way or another, bearing in mind, of course, that again, like I'm just like stressing the fact that we don't really have many opportunities where some like autonomous public rethinking of many of the realities are available in the region. So to go through the findings, there are 3 main findings, and I'm here like being brutally short on this. The first one is like the MENA, and this is not a surprise to anyone, the Middle East and North Africa more generally has been inserted as a producer of raw materials, especially fossil fuels. This has been the case in a way that is quite disappointingly unchanging for the past 40 years. The share of fossil fuels in total exports of the region as a whole stood for almost 2/3 in 1974 and remained so in 2014. Which is something that tells us that much of the diversification that happened, and some considerable diversification happened, within the economies of many Arab countries, including the oil-rich ones, like the big exporters of oil. Much of this diversification was quite domestic. It did not influence in any significant manner the external sector, like how they relate to the rest of the world, the role that they played in trade, like the upgrading into higher value-added niches in areas of manufacturing or skill-intensive services or whatever. So this is a reality that we are stuck in to a great extent, and it is not just about the oil-rich countries, because the oil-rich countries are the ones that are the most engaging with the global trade, because they are the ones that have something to sell to the world. However, there are these extensive political economic mechanisms through which this oil and gas-based rent got redistributed, which is something that definitely intersects considerably with the security arrangements that have existed in the region, political as well as security ones, and that are still there. So the problem here is how to push this diversification to redefine pretty much what the region and the nations of the region that are quite interrelated to each other or with each other, how they can redefine their position in the world. Related to this is that there has been some considerable human development gains in the past 50 or 60 years throughout most of the Arab countries. But again, much of this has concealed significant levels of inequality on not only on like subnational, regional, definitely ethno-sectarian, as well as the different, like the gender is one key issue, but also between the nations. So it's within the nations, between the nations, in a way that might tell us like why the region has become the host of the highest density of conflict in the past decade, more or less. So this is the first finding. The second finding is that there have been very weak levels of economic integration on the national level, on the regional level, as well as in the on the international level. Meaning that regionally, much of the exchange that happens between the countries is an exchange between capital-rich and labor-rich countries. So you have these very large flows of capital, usually from oil-rich countries, in one form or another, either workers' remittances, different forms of aid, different forms of public or private investment. And in return, you have this significant movement throughout the past 40 or 50 years of, well, like migrant workers. The problem here is that this mode of integration on the regional level creates what was dubbed by some scholars a region without regionalism, because we don't have much trade, we don't have much integration when it comes to the production and the distribution of value. Hence we have some patterns of integration. It's not that we don't have it. But the problem is the form of that integration that has its own very negative impact on the ability to insert the suppliers or the producers within the region in regional and later on global value chains. And one of the interesting things is that this came with low levels of national integration, the idea that we have many of the, like national economic integration, the idea that we have many of the like Arab economies themselves having or suffering from problems like the missing middle syndrome. The idea that we have like usually very few, extremely large and concentrated enterprises that either publicly or privately owned. And these are the ones that are more or less the globalizers, like the ones that have the ability to produce some value. And these are floating on an ocean of extremely small like establishments or enterprises. They're not really enterprises in any formal sense, that are stuck in undercapitalized, very low growth, low productivity sections. And if we take a look at one of the best performance in the context of globalization in the world, like a comparator case in East Asia and Southeast Asia to a lesser extent, there we have national economies that prove to be much better integrated, and hence that enable the creation of regional value chains where producers can get vertically integrated. And that itself is part and parcel of the global, like the better integration in global value chains that, again, from an inter-regional perspective, East and Southeast Asia definitely outperformed many of the regions. The Arab world was, to a great extent, stuck with a lower performance, which is, by the way, not unique, not exceptional. Like Latin America suffers from very similar problems, South Asia the same. But, and that's why we tried to bring in, again, like this global South perspective. The third finding is mainly the one about the why question, which is like the normative question. And this is based on an excellent paper that was authored by Professor Huda about like the values according to which we need to rethink the socio-economic reality as well as the future of the region. I won't go into details here, but we aimed or we tried to bring in some critical stance on the overall discourse so that our contribution is not necessarily within a framework that has been set to a great extent outside of the region and to a great extent outside of the global south more generally, like having to do with the hegemony of neoliberalism, with the context of IFI conditionality, austerity since the 1980s onwards. So this is rather, or this was a very conscious attempt at bringing this to the table. In like the last part, which is the one on the way forward, we didn't call them recommendations, as I was saying, because we didn't want to end up writing like how we wish to see things or what should be done. This is, of course, like the university is part of a civil society, like of a public sphere to a great extent, and this debate itself is, we think at least, that it is like valuable and it is needed. But there are definitely, we tried to build on the possible areas where things can, or where we might like proceed, or the region can proceed, as well as, of course, the nations that compose of which the region consists. So to start with, definitely there is a great demand for reform. Following the 2011-2019 turmoil that like went throughout the region, there is considerable demand for reform, and there's no reason not to think that there is like a supply side for such reform. The issue is not really the willingness; it's really the ability, because to tackle many of these challenges simultaneously is quite daunting to start with. So there are certain areas. One of the authors of the papers that are included there talked about certain concessions, certain areas where economic activity can be cleared, so that we have more participation and higher quality participation of a bigger number of people in the production of and distribution of value. And this is something that can definitely help in tackling or addressing the missing middle syndrome, so that the adoption of policies as well as institutional arrangements, something that many policy reformers, by the way, are already aware of, whether we agree on the details or not. But the idea of addressing the question of national integration can itself simultaneously create better opportunities for regional integration as well, which is one dimension, by the way, that we tackle quite seriously. but not from a necessarily a pan-Arab, like ideologically motivated perspective, but rather based on the realities and the potentialities that are there, while being very aware of the restraints. And of course, the last thing that gets me back to what Ambassador Izzeddin was talking about is the post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization efforts, and how these are very much recommended to be tackled from a regional perspective rather than a country-to-country on a country-to-country basis, but also how this is very much possible already building and capitalizing on existing patterns of interaction. So we can talk about already existing like spheres or zones that are pretty much cross-border, that are translocal. If you think of Lebanon in relation to Syria and Jordan, for instance. If one thinks of Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. So to a great extent, these are already very like vibrant and alive economic zones, and this is how the civil wars in one country had its own spillover, like economically, demographically, politically, etc. So this is definitely an area where many of the security as well as socio-economic concerns can be addressed in the future. Again, that's a very, very general idea. It's not that this is like how it should be done. Again, what we are trying to do here is to offer something that is well thought of, that is empirically based, that is rich in details, that is well theorized, we claim it to be, for a broader debate. So it's just like an input, one single ingredient in like a bigger endeavor. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Adli, and thank you to both presenters for very ably, I think, giving us an overview of the report as a whole. Two reflections I would offer, which you may want to address in the Q&A session. The first deals with the linkages between both sections of the report, the socioeconomic section and the regional security section. And this is an area that I think, as a group, we could have explored more in depth. But you both touched on areas of overlap, for example, on post-conflict reconstruction, on the resource dimension of regional conflicts. I think the concept of human security fits very well in terms of both areas. And so perhaps you could give us your thoughts and expanding on how these linkages might be assessed. The second reflection I have is about scenarios. So the Regional Security Working Group framed its analysis and its recommendations in terms of scenarios. Scenarios meaning not in terms of specific predictions, but a general description of what the future might look like. And as Ambassador Ramzi said, the most plausible scenario is one of stabilization. And I'm curious to know from Amr if it would be possible to frame your analysis in terms of scenarios. So if all things being equal, what is the scenario that might be before us in the near future? If the majority of your way forward is actually adopted, what would that scenario also look like? So with that, let me move to our other two panelists. Dr. Rashad, you worked very intensely on the social dimensions of the discussion of the working group. And perhaps you can address that particular dimension and your reflections on the report as a whole.
Thank you very much. My colleagues provided very informative highlights of the report. And in my reflection, I would like to emphasize the importance of articulating our goals and of engaging critically with what we are doing to realize these goals. You know, the report is about envisioning a better future. So I think this invites directly three basic questions. What is a better future. And are we on the right track? And more importantly, what is the way forward? In terms of what is the better future, I would say that the vision would be the well-being of people and well-being equity. To my mind, well-being equity is at the center of the vision of the Arab development. Should be, it isn't actually, but it should be at the center of the vision for Arab development. And before I go on, I just want to clarify some concepts related to well-being equity. The first is that we should be concerned with systematic, avoidable, or preventable differences in well-being among social groups. The equity is about the fairness of policies, actions, and social arrangements that shape the social structure of the society. So the well-being distribution that we should be concerned about, we judge it to be inequitable when we trace that distribution to upstream forces, to policies, action, social arrangement that result in unfair opportunities and biased treatment. So really, when I speak about well-being equity, I speak about the fact that the root causes of the inequitable distribution of well-being is blamed on, and I quote from the literature, unfair policies, poor social arrangements, and bad politics. When we discuss well-being equity, we have to realize that there are two prerequisites that would show that a country is really adopting the well-being equity. The first, it should be placed as our end goals. And if you tell me it is placed as our end goals, I would ask you, do you know about the distribution of well-being? Do you use the distribution of well-being as a criteria for your success? Do you use it as a criteria for the success or failure of the development model, rather than use it as an after-the-fact secondary concern? That's the first prerequisite for really articulating our vision as well-being and well-being equity. The second prerequisite is to understand that fairness in society is central to the well-being. You need fairness in order to realize well-being. But it's not just central to well-being. It's also central to cohesive societies and resilient nations. In terms of its centrality to well-being, it's easy to show that the disadvantage that is created by inequities is killing people. It's killing people at a large scale. It is producing unnecessary sufferings, and it's undermining social and mental well-being. And there are enough evidence to show that and, in the literature. But the second point that is not, that doesn't come to mind very easily is that fairness is an ingredient for cohesive societies. This is particularly true when we think of the concept of fairness is not just about material factors. The concept of fairness relates to non-discrimination, relates to participation, relates to freedom. So the biased power relations in societies, they break the very fabric. They lead to marginalized and disgruntled social groups. They feed the extremism. They threaten the security of nations. And this is provide some link between what the socioeconomic and the security. The third reason for the importance of the equity, the well-being equity paradigm, is that we are at a time where we are facing global risks. COVID-19, climate change, occupation, wars. During this time, this provides an additional ammunition to pursue fairness. This ammunition is not really just about the disgrace that you are feeling that was exposed by those global threats. This ammunition is driven by the ethical impairment due to the disgrace, but more importantly, we need to recognize that enactment of the required transformation change to address the biosocial and opportunity distribution. This in itself is an essential infrastructure for the country. It builds the resilience of the country. It allows it to navigate and minimize the impact of crisis, whatever that crisis is. And again, Dr. Karim, that links us very closely with the security and the turmoils that we're facing in our nation. This vision that I'm talking about is not an invention. I mean, this is well recognized in the international literature. It has been talked about a lot, and there are actually countries who have adopted policies and action to pursue that vision. Unfortunately, in the Arab region, we cannot claim that this is part of our vision. And in a way, this leads me to my second question, which is, are we on the right track? What are we doing? What are we doing in our countries to pursue our vision for development, not the vision I was talking about of equity and well-being? Well, let's reflect on what's happening. The Arab countries committed themselves to the Sustainable Development Goals. Every country in the region have signed on the Sustainable Development Goals. And the truth is, many countries are doing their best to monitor the action they're doing and to calculate performance indicators. So they're working on that front. The second, many of our countries, of the Arab countries, talk about inequalities. They also adopted ambitious nationwide initiatives to target the disadvantaged groups. And there are many examples of that in our region. Thirdly, and it's quite important, they did identify key discriminatory practices in our society. You know, when we talk about gender and the emphasis on gender, it's a reflection of Arab countries' attempt to redress injustices by gender. Some countries are sort of modestly trying to address injustices on religious ground, others on other grounds. So there is that element there. So they're working hard. I mean, they're trying to achieve a better future. If we look at the performance, there are, like my colleague said, there are varying degrees of progress in a number of outcome indicators. The resource-endowed countries, the Gulf countries, they boast a high level of socioeconomic development. The middle-income countries are showing positive change. Of course, there are the remaining countries that are really suffering from turmoils and conflicts, and understandably, they are now in a survival mode. So what is the overall impression? The impression could be we are heading in the right direction with all that efforts that I'm talking about. And if we just persevere, if we just pass through the difficult transition phase caused by past mistakes, we'll be there. We'll get to the brighter future. But the brighter future is about well-being, isn't it? So the question is, has these efforts translated to the goal of well-being and to the goal of well-being equity. We should appreciate that improving socioeconomic conditions, investing in capabilities, addressing excess sufferings, they are essential for well-being. It's a given. And if we are not addressing the current challenge, it may take away from the urgency of the discussion I'm talking about of fairness. Because if we are at a low level of performance, if we are at a low socioeconomic situation, the truth is the inequality is less severe. And the truth is the aspiration of people are confined to satisfying their basic needs. So I'm saying that because I don't want this intervention to be seen as dismissive of the current efforts. I want this intervention to be seen that the current efforts are appreciated, they need to happen, they should continue. However, we need to build on them and move forward and move in a different way. So let me return to the goal of well-being. These efforts are made with an implicit assumption that they will lead to an improved well-being. But do we have any evidence that there is an improvement in the well-being of people? We don't have evidence to tell us what's happening in the distribution of well-being. We don't have evidence about the progress of well-being. We don't have scientific data to tell us that. And this in itself is a telling answer. So what we're doing, we are really repeating the economic notion of trickle-down effect. But what we're doing it in a different way, which is a trickle-after effect. We're making the efforts, and we are assuming, of course, it will improve well-being. Fortunately, the very recent UN happiness report that was just published places most of the Arab region at the very low end of that report, of the countries in the world. Even the Arab-rich countries, they're a little up there because, of course, the economy and the resources contribute to well-being, but they don't have a seat in the front row. So why there is a disconnect between the well-being as an end impact goal and the foundational goals that are currently pursued to reach it? Where did we go wrong? And this is actually the key messages. The first, we confined the definition of the challenge in our region as underperformance. But we did not incorporate the principle of fairness in that definition. Second, we are not forcefully addressing enough the values of discrimination with their cultural and religious underpinnings. We are not prioritizing inclusiveness and participation. The intersection between disadvantage and the power relation is in the heart of the notion of fairness. So I'm not talking just about the fairness about distribution of public service or distribution of basic water and sanitation or income or employment. I'm talking about a vision of fairness that include everybody and include the participation part. The third shortcoming is that we are not differentiating between inequalities and inequities. So there is a feel, since we are concerned with the disadvantaged, then we are going the right way. But what we don't understand that these are not disparities. These are injustices. And unless we frame those differences as injustices, our approach to them is very different. It's just a remedial approach. So I think I'll go to my last kind of question, which is, what is the way forward? trying to find my way forward, and I can't find it, but I can remember what I was saying. The way forward is for a new framing of development. It's for governance and policy reforms that are anchored on the well-being paradigm. It's a call for adopting fairness in the social patterns of well-being as a measure of development and social success. And like my colleague said before me, we're not prescribing. This is not prescriptive. We could prescribe because there are certain prescriptions that could be said. But the approach that we are lobbying for seeks three things. First, a value change. The compass of fairness demands endorsement and commitment at the highest political level. We don't hear that at all. We hear, maybe I know of one example in our region I was telling you about, but generally speaking, that value is not pushed to the forefront. The second, we ask for policy coherence and for the whole of government responsibilities. Of course, this requires structures, this requires resources to nurture intersectoral action in order to reach the end goal. Finally, we're asking for participation and accountability. This, in particular, is very relevant to an academic institution like AUC. The project that we're talking about today demonstrates the recognition of AUC of the importance of participation and engagement with the regional efforts for a better future. I'll quote Eugene Nabil in the foreword of the report when you said, AUC clearly takes seriously its role as a social conscience towards the well-being of the Arab world and as a convener for Arab voices. This is exactly what we're trying to do in this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rashad. You've really added, I think, a very important dimension to the discussion here about regarding social well-being and equity. With that, let me move to our final panelist. So, Dr. Anderson, the three previous speakers have been immersed in this exercise for the last 3 years. You come at this with a fresh pair of eyes. And it would be very interesting to hear from you, given your experience as a scholar and an observer of the region's politics, international relations, reading the culmination of this exercise. What jumps out for you? What did this group get right? What did it get wrong? What was missing in this report? So with your fresh pair of eyes, please give us your reflection.
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to congratulate all of the contributors to this project. It's a little intimidating, actually, to come in on such an ambitious effort. But I have a few observations that I think echo some of what we've already heard this evening. The ambassador calls this an opportune time to launch this wider discussion from AUC, and I think that's obviously true. On the other hand, it's also a difficult time. As he pointed out, there have been a series of, if you will, local events from 9/11 to the invasion of Iraq and the Arab Spring that, as he put it, revealed deficiencies, also obviously revealed the porousness of the region, if you will. A lot of apparently mischievous external interventions in various of the parts of the region by both regional and extra-regional actors have created enormous difficulties at this regional level. But the local problems are obviously within a global context, which is itself also extremely challenging. We are, and Egypt will shortly be in the spotlight for discussions of climate and environment that is going to be incredibly important. And that's something that is, at the moment, sort of in the background, but will be increasingly foregrounded as we go forward into the next decades. The health crisis is also a global crisis. We can't think about health in a national or regional way any longer, obviously. And interstate and intrastate conflict is obviously something that's on the news today outside the region. So that too is a global challenge. What the outcome and consequences of the events in Ukraine will resonate everywhere. So it's a region with regional issues and problems in a global context with its own issues and challenges. So I think it's a, as I say, perhaps opportune, but particularly difficult. That said, I want to congratulate you all on wanting to capture the discourse about the future. It's important to be thinking about the future and not be paralyzed or intimidated by the kinds of challenges that I just rehearsed and that we all know about. And I'd like to suggest that there's a sort of underlying commitment in the report to the idea that peace and prosperity are possible, that conflict isn't necessary, isn't the way the world has to be, and that prosperity is similarly something possible. That if we are imaginative, if we think about the future in a particular way, these are goals and aspirations to which we can turn ourselves. In both cases, I think there is an implicit, although perhaps it could be more explicit, predicate to that, and I think Dr. Hoda has made this case very clearly, that both peace and prosperity are fundamentally based on justice. And if we don't think in terms of justice as an element to how we will pursue our efforts at conflict resolution or at enhancing prosperity, we are likely to be challenged by that. So I think there's a very becomingly optimistic element to the report, that there are ways to think about the future that are both realistic and aspirational. And that's exactly the way we ought to be approaching these challenges. Now, there are two elements I'd just like to sort of pull out of the report that I think are talk across the two subsections of the report, and Kareem, you actually raised this, but I'd like to pursue it a little bit more. There's a creative ambiguity in the notion of region and in the notion of security. So let me take each of those. In some parts of the report, there is admission, acknowledgement, observation that Arab nationalism has been superseded by other kinds of identities and other kinds of relationships, and yet the Arab world is an organizing principle here. So I think we really need to think about whether it's been superseded or whether it's an organizing principle. And in fact, some of the newer organizational structures that are described, the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum and the Abraham Accords, are both actually about markets, not about identities. So let's think about what we mean by region. Do we mean regional economic ties? Do we mean regional ethnic and linguistic ties? What is the region here? And how do the kinds of economic relationships we have, we see, we advocate, how do they affect conceptions of regional identity? And then conversely, how do the political institutions, especially the continuing existence of sovereign states, shape and distort markets? And that's part of what Dr. Adler was talking about. On the one hand, we want these kinds of regional relationships. On the other hand, they are challenges to, and are challenged by the political organization of the region. So yes, in a way, I think this is a region without regionalism, and it's worth trying to define precisely what that means. So that's my first observation. My second observation about creative ambiguity is security. What do we mean by security? The international relations folks have a definition of security which is well known and is reflected in the parts of the report that deal with conflict and regional relationships among states. But the other side of the report also talks about security and talks about human security. So I think we really need to try and get a clearer grasp on whose security are we talking about. Are we talking about the security of the states in the region? Are we talking about the security of the regimes in the region, which are not necessarily the same thing? Are we talking about the security of business relationships or markets? Are we talking about the security of individuals? And if we're talking about individuals, what kind of individuals? How do we identify the responsibility of any of our audience here, the policymakers of the world, the policymakers of the region? How do we want them to think about who they are responsible for? Citizens? Refugees? Migrants? People in other countries? How do we, who are we worrying about here? So I think that it's important to think about security as embedded in these kinds of questions about who policymakers are responsible for, who their audiences are, for whom should we expect anyone to be making investments in the region. So those are the two, I think, genuinely creative ambiguities in the report, but I think they're worth exploring further as you go on to address policymakers. And that is my final point. Who is your audience? Who are the policymakers that you want to hear your observations? Clearly, governments are a principal audience, and I hope you do distribute this widely to governments, obviously within Egypt, but throughout the region. There may be opportunities in post-conflict reconstruction. There may be opportunities to think about new ways of making investments and so forth, but I think you need to be thinking about whether some of your audience is a regional business community. Some of your audience may be international organizations of various kinds. I think, to really make pointed the kinds of observations and recommendations implicit in the report will be enhanced by thinking through the very large potential audience. So I think if you think about the fact that what you really are talking about is the prospects for peace and prosperity in the region, that these are genuine prospects, that there is a way of framing the challenges to that, but also in the anticipation that these are reasonable aims, that those will be inevitably based on a conviction that justice is part of what resolves conflicts and part of what grows economies and well-being, then I think you will have made an enormous contribution to the discourse and the policy for the next several decades in the region. And for that, you should be very proud, and we should be very grateful that you've thought about the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, it strikes me how you frame the essential message of this report, that peace and prosperity are within the realm of the possible. And yes, that is a message that was very much part of the overall narrative of this report. But it strikes me that this is very different from the global narrative about the region. That in that global narrative, injustice and conflict seem to be endemic to the region. So that, I think, is a very interesting contrast of narratives that we can explore. So thank you all to the panelists. So in anticipation of the very rich discussion that I expected to take place within this group, I asked the dean for some latitude in terms of time, and he graciously agreed. So we have about 20 or 25 minutes for rounds of questions. So at this point, I would like to invite members of the audience to pose their questions, comments, reflections on the discussion of the panel so far. And I will call on you if you would like to please identify yourself and please clarify who you are directing this to, or else I will take this to the panel as a whole. Yes, the gentleman at the back there.
Okay, I am Ahmed El-Bouhi, Master of Global Affairs from AUC, and I am PhD students in International Affairs at Cairo University. My question is directed to all the panelists. The report have discussed many prospect futures and future scenarios for the Middle East. But one thing that I have found absent, I'm not sure if it is there, maybe you can clarify, is the very crucial issue of water security. There are many Arab states are entering a very maybe severe threat from other regional states, not only in Egypt. We are all familiar with the situation in Egypt and Nahda Dam and all of this, but also in Syria and Iraq are facing similar, maybe more severe water security challenges from Turkey. So what are the future prospects for that? This is my main question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If there are any other questions from the floor, let me take it to the panel to give very quick reflections in answer to that question. And this is for anybody who would like to be takers for this. Ambassador Ramzi, let me call on you, since the issue of resources was touched on in the context of the report.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the question. I think I referred to it in my earlier presentation. The issue of resource scarcity, and I particularly emphasize water scarcity and also food deficiency. Water scarcity is, as you pointed out, is not only a problem for Egypt, but also certainly for Iraq and Syria. Now, in the report, it should be integrated in the security framework. If we're talking about a future security framework that is inspired by the OSCE process, but also using the experience of the arms control and disarmament working group that was part of the Madrid peace conference, which had a working group on environment and water. So if you're ever going to have a regional framework, even if it starts within the Arab region and then it is expanded to include Turkey, Iran, and Israel, certainly water will be very prominent, and because it does affect the national security of at least 3 Arab states, if not more.
Thank you.
So the point is that, of course, this is a framing report. So we didn't have the chance to go into neither national issues nor like specific questions. The water issue, of course, is definitely quite pressing. The problem is that it requires most probably like a project on its own that can be like informed by this framing, because whereas we are very much aware of the geopolitical dimension of the notorious inability to coordinate the management of international rivers, which is not just a problem in the Middle East and North Africa. It's rather the problem. Usually, it's the norm rather than the exception. This is one of the areas where usually governments fail, with some notable exceptions that we should be aware of. But there is also the broader framing of water scarcity, which is not necessarily or exclusively related to geopolitics. Like North Africa, for instance, like the whole region, not only the Arab region, but like the semi-tropical areas have a problem with aridity, with desertification, because of climate change. So that's the issue in North Africa, for instance, in Tunisia, in Algeria, as well as in Morocco. These are countries that have been hit by rounds of droughts. That's the issue in Yemen as well. So you have this combination of demographic increase and a rising problem of water scarcity in many parts of the world. So I think that the overall weaving in of the question of environment into both security and like future economic development is definitely there. We try to do that, but that might might invite further, more focused research effort.
Thank you. Questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Mariam Wouzaid. I hold a master's in economics and international development and have the honor of working at the Social Research Center as a research assistant. And I just had a general question for the panel about specifically GCC countries and the rentier economy kind of format they follow and the current global climate. Could that actually move them away from urgency to reform, given the current climate and changes, for example, in oil prices? Could that actually deter the progress that might have been going on recently?
Thank you. Panelists? A probing question about the GCC.
I can take this. Well, the issue here is, like, you are referring to the recent increase in energy prices, right? So the problem is that we have the same pattern still, that international energy prices are not set by the by the exporters. So you end up with dependency on the exporting of energy without having the ability to set the price. So the episode of the 1970s proved to be the exception rather than the norm, especially with the recent, not very recent, but like the technological innovation and advancement that allowed the production of shale oil on a big scale all over the world has even diminished further the share in all over and like world production of many of the OPEC countries, the GCC included. So the question with diversification, I don't think is a problem of will. The issue is that you already have well, we have diversification plans that were set in the mid-1980s and in the second half of the 1980s in response to the oil glut of 1986 and the the sheer decline of oil prices and with it the rent that was accumulated by it. But the issue is that many of the rentier economies are, well, they are stuck to a great extent with these cycles of commodity boom and commodity bust. It's quite typical of oil production, but it also applies to some other forms of raw material production as well. So I don't think that it's about whether we have the context in which the GCC governments, as well as the oil exporting nations more generally, by the way, because the GCC proved to be among the most resilient and the less vulnerable because they have small populations, they accumulated huge reserves in the boom years stretching from 2008 until 2014 that proved that came in handy through the years of low energy prices. The problem is rather with the more populated, very oil dependent countries like Iraq, like Algeria, for instance, is a very, very dramatic case of like the depletion, the rate at which the foreign reserves got depleted, etc. So it's a major issue here, that it's not about whether they came to realize how problematic is the dependency on oil. This is something that most probably was there from the very beginning. But again, it's about the extremely hard, well, like the extremely rare cases, as a matter of fact, of diversifying away from oil dependency. We don't have many cases of countries that remained oil rich that could do this. I'm not saying that they are like necessarily doomed in that position, but definitely the recent like shift, not only because of the war in Ukraine, but even before that, the increase in oil energy prices is likely to reinforce the same old patterns again. Of expecting higher oil prices, better rent. And the problem here is very much with the region as a whole, not only with the primary generators of rent, because this rent gets redistributed later on within the region.
Dr. Anderson and then Dr. Willis.
I just would like to suggest that there's a little bit of a missing piece in some of this discussion. Many of, particularly the low population, high oil-producing countries, have begun a kind of energy transition which is called a sovereign wealth fund. They're getting into finance. And I think we who tend to think of trade need to be thinking more about finance and need to be thinking about the fact that many of these governments are beginning to think that the way they're actually going to end up funding some of the things that the oil revenues fund now are going to be investments. So whether that works or not as a transition, I think it's something that we collectively need to be thinking much more about. Finance has become such an important part of the global economy in the last 30 or 40 years, and many of these governments realize that they have an opportunity to sort of solidify their positions by becoming, often in conjunction with private investors, investors on a global scale. And that's going to change the name of the game for, again, particularly the small, wealthy countries.
Dr. Huda.
I would like to link the two questions of crisis with the notion of the Arab region that Dr. Anderson really sort of commented on, and I think it's very important. In the answers to the crisis, whether it's water, whether it's oil, we are aware that the Arab region is not uniform. So implicit in the answer is that there are differentiated impact given the context of each country, and that, of course, the strategies need to be responsive to those type of changes. It's an Arab region, but it's divided into categories, groups of countries, and so on. But I would like to dwell on the fact that when we talk about threats and crises at the level of a country, we never consider seriously that those crises do have differentiated impact on different groups of people. So we solve the crisis of water as a general strategy and scenario, while this doesn't this doesn't provide the solution. What we need to do is to really adopt clear, responsive policies to the differentiated condition. I mean, when you think of COVID-19 and when you think of the education system, particularly children who didn't go to school, and all of a sudden women who are themselves in the labor market are bearing the brunt of having to take care of their children who are staying at home and they cannot stay at home. I mean, there are issues like that need to be part and parcel of any discourse on risks, on crises, because we are different groups in our society, and we suffer differently. But the policy seems to be addressing a core disadvantage and simply provide one solution for all, and it doesn't really fit.
If I could maybe ask a final question, particularly to Ambassador Ramzi, but also Dr. Anderson, about the role of interested outside actors in this discussion. So, assuming that there does emerge within the region what we might call a serious reformist project, right? That does take serious steps on the way forward, as we've described in this report. How should the relevant outside actors that have been invested in this region historically, the United States, Russia, the development agencies and donor community, the European Union, what should the region ask of these interested parties? And how should we frame the message in terms of how they can assist and support this project? Ambassador Ramzi, can I call on you first?
Yes, of course. Before I answer your question, maybe I would like to comment on something you had said earlier about linkages between the two groups. And you pointed out that there are two areas of linkage. One is post-conflict stabilization, and the other, I would put it under the general heading of governance. And I would add a third one, which is resource scarcity. And these are the three areas which really overlap between the two groups. And when we speak about governance, it's about having a new social contract, and that has both a political and economic dimension. And there may have been more than one, I would say, model of social contracts in the 50s and 60s. Now, it's not clear that there is one uniform one in the Arab world. Whether there will ever be one that is uniform remains to be seen, but I can certainly say that sub-regions can have their own models. Now, on the issue of post-conflict stabilization, this is one of the main problems that the region faces. It faces them because they are a result of the failures of governments that have opened up the region to foreign interventions, and we've seen that in many countries. And some of these countries are almost failed states. Now, this is also an issue of governance. Third, the issue of scarcity, and I think we referred to it earlier, particularly the issue of water scarcity, but also food deficiency. And now it's become so obvious with Ukraine, where a number of major Arab countries, such as Egypt and Algeria, for example, are highly dependent on Ukraine and Russia, but so are the Gulf states. Now, going back to your question about outside actors and what we can ask of them. Well, let me take them one by one. The EU, which is close to the region, there are, I would say, complementarities. So it should be a win-win situation. It's not just asking from them, but actually how we can both work together to have a win-win situation. Now, the EU is, and I think it's become more obvious now, in need of ensuring its energy security. And I think this is something that the region can offer, but not only in terms of fossil fuels, but renewable energy and electricity down the road. And I think this is something we can offer them. But we also need technology from them. We need them to be, frankly, more active in finding solutions to the conflicts in the region. They have not been as active as they should be, but because they have been unable to decouple themselves from American strategy and security concerns. The United States, I think what we need from the United States more than anything else is to be more active in finding a solution or helping us finding a solution to the conflicts in the region, particularly the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think this is where the United States can play a role. Now, in terms of security arrangements, with the United States looking elsewhere, but still remaining in the region, I think this is something that has to be discussed with the United States and see how it can help with stabilizing the region and moving on in establishing a security, regional security framework. With Russia, now Russia has become much more active in the region after its military intervention in Syria. And Russia is here to stay. I think Syria has become a very important part of their not only regional strategy, but international strategy. Having two bases, one a naval and an air base in Syria, and I think this is something that we need to keep into account. So it is going to be there, and we have to deal with it as such. Now, what do we need from Russia? Russia is very active in the field of nuclear technology, not only in the region but beyond, and I think more active than any other country at this stage. And I think this is something that can be developed further. They want access to Africa down the road, and I think the region, particularly Egypt and North Africa, can be a gateway for that, so we can cooperate with them on that issue. But of course, given what is happening in Ukraine now, I think, well, it's good and bad. It gives us time to think exactly how we want to approach things with Russia. But I think it's bad because its ramifications are not yet fully clear to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Lisa, it falls on you to have the last word in this conversation.
Well, thank you for that. I completely agree with the ambassador on the kinds of things that regional governments might want to ask from the interested outsiders, as you call them. But I think we ought to be candid that you can ask, but you may not get an answer. And I think since Brexit, the EU has been actually involved in internal challenges of Franco-German competition, so forth and so on. They've got their own issues. Obviously, since Trump, the United States has been preoccupied with it's very clear it's very hard to tell who speaks for the United States in any consistent way at this point. And frankly, I think with the situation in Ukraine, the same will be true of Russia. So most of the global powers that have an interest in this region are actually preoccupied with problems at home and will be for some time. And so I think actually, again, it's going to be difficult, but there may be opportunities not to ask, to try and figure out what kinds of solutions are available here, rather than to turn to all of the outsiders that have always been invited to provide solutions. In any event, I think it's the global level challenges are going to be significant, partly because there's clearly a transition in some of the most important global powers. That will continue for some time. But again, thank you for this opportunity to think about the future.
Thank you, Lisa. So at the end of this panel discussion, a few words of thanks are in order. To our panelists, a special word of thanks for what I thought was a very rich and insightful discussion that really reflects, I think, the substance and content of the report. So thank you to all the panelists. A real word of thanks, I think, to the university for sponsoring this exercise. President Dalal, Provost Abdurrahman, I think, or we hope that this exercise has lived up to the standards of the university in terms of public service and policy research, which was reflected in the final outcome. And then, of course, a word of thanks to all of you for participating in this launch event. And then finally, really a word of thanks to Dean Fahmy. Dean Fahmy has been the impetus, the driving force of this exercise. And I think without his commitment and sustained engagement in seeing this through, the result would have been different, I think, during a very difficult time of COVID especially. So a word of thanks to Dean Fahmy, the university, the panelists, and the audience. Thank you.